Hi, welcome, and thank you for joining us. I'm Adam, Director of Product Strategy and Go-to-Market at Oasis Security, and today I want to take you behind the scenes into what we've been hearing from our customers, where the scale tends to be massive, the stakes can be high, and the identities we're defending aren't even human. So this won't be a theoretical conversation. These will be actual stories from the front line, drawn from what we see every day working with identity and security teams across different industries. What we are learning is that identity security is undergoing a massive shift where old IAM playbooks are no longer always applicable. And security teams are struggling to keep up with a rapidly growing new attack surface, driven by the explosion of non-human identities, or NHIs. So for today, I'll show you how teams are tackling this challenge with a modern approach, and of course, how you can too. We'll start with exploring the change we're seeing, how it's impacting the teams fighting the good fight every day, what we can do about it, and what we've learned about building a scalable, proactive process. Cool. So I always like to start with explaining what exactly is a non-human identity, since this is a fairly hyped up term these days, and it gets thrown around a lot. For me, NHIs, they're known by many names: service accounts, workload identities, principals, IAM roles, API keys, tokens, a couple other ones as well. But the important thing they all have in common is that they're used by workloads or apps or automations to access resources and data. And that really makes them the silent backbone of your infrastructure. Now, I already mentioned them. We, of course, all know that service accounts are, they're the canonical example of non-human identities living in your Active Directory. But the space is a lot larger now. Many of these NHIs, they can exist in a variety of other places, in your cloud, in CI/CD pipelines, in enterprise SaaS applications, and more. Unfortunately, they also have a tendency to find their way into a couple other insecure places. We'll get to that in a bit. Anyway, the bottom line is NHIs are powerful, often highly privileged, and persistent, typically being far less governed than really they should be. So I guess what's changed recently, and the largest shift happening today is really that over 95% of identities in modern environments are now non-human. 95. We'll talk about how we got to this place in a second, but this is an extremely large number, and it's been published in a variety of different research papers, including one by ESG around managing non-human identities. Now, on the other hand, our tools, our policies, even our mental models to some extent, they're still built for human access, and that causes some problems. But before we get there, I wanted to go back to that 95% number. And it's worth asking how did we get here, right? So simply put, every business initiative these days, it requires creating more NHIs, be it your IT or cloud transformation, be it mergers and acquisitions, be it automation. And of course, you can go ahead and mark Gen AI off your vendor bingo as well. And the modern business is evolving, and as that happens, the need for further interconnectivity drives the creation of more and more of these NHIs. Let's take as a very simple example a typical CI/CD pipeline. Now, it probably uses multiple identities or tokens for things like builds or tests or deploys. Maybe as another example, your latest AI training job requires access to databases or storage via users or service accounts or tokens. And that's needed to grant access to these sensitive sources of data. The kicker, of course, is that these identities often don't get cleaned up, remain there for quite some time. And so what we see is not just scale, it's also compounding sprawl. Now, once teams are able to understand the problem space, usually that's where we kickstart an initiative. At this point, we encounter a variety of challenges and pain points related to NHIs. We hear from a lot of our customers and from practitioners in the industry how this impedance mismatch between the expectation and reality causes some real hardships. And this is really no matter of the company's size, industry, or maturity. These same stories they tend to keep surfacing. So this really ranges from a lack of understanding of how many accounts even exists and what they do, to having accounts without established credentials or owners, or secrets finding their way into insecure sources without anyone knowing better. When we take a step back, these quotes really they reveal a system level problem. And that's a breakdown in how we discover, manage, and control these non-human identities. Let's start with the beginning, essentially. And that's how we see them. Because visibility, this is true across a variety of different fields. It's always step one. And a good test we often use to measure the maturity of an organization when we start working with them is a deceptively simple one. We ask if they know how many human accounts they have. The answer to this one is usually pretty straightforward and high confidence, which is as you would expect. However, when we ask the same question about non-human identities, we ask them, how many NHIs do you have? That's usually where they draw a blank. And so we hear quotes like the one listed here, stating that they can't really tell us how many exist, where they are, and what they're connected to. We've briefly spoken about the various ways identities can be created in the wild, and this means that traditional identity inventory methods like CMDBs or manual audits, they just aren't cutting it anymore. Because at the pace new identities are created, any manual inventory effort is almost immediately out of date. The result is blind spots, right? So teams will think they have maybe hundreds of accounts where the real number is in the thousands. And part of the problem is that the number almost never shrinks. That's because it's very easy to create new identities, but most organizations we talk to don't have a clear process to remove them when they aren't needed, right? So if we talked about mental models, the joiner mover lever we're all very familiar with, the lever is kind of forgotten on the non-human identities. By the way, a lack of an up-to-date inventory is a contributing reason or cause to this. Had they known that access they granted to some POC 5 years ago was still laying around there, privileged, external, and unused, they'd probably clean it up. And so to move forward, what we always recommend is starting with a continuous automated view of every NHI, but also enriching it with context, not just what it is, but also where it came from, who's using it, what access does it grant. Because otherwise, if we're not seeing clearly, we're just trying to secure shadows, which, of course, that's not going to be very easy. So what we see here, this chart is a very common example we see in the field. This specific example is from a healthcare company that we evaluated that's an Azure shop. Now, the team we worked with there, they thought going into this that they had maybe 2,500 service accounts across all their systems. However, when we ran this discovery and inventory scan, we found that the number was actually closer to 6,000 service accounts, and that's just in their AD without factoring the almost 2,000 additional cloud service principals. This, unfortunately, is not just a one-time example. It's a pattern we see consistently and constantly. The number we see is almost always higher than the number we expected. And that's because not only do you not have a good grasp on the environments you considered, but there are also many different environments you weren't even thinking of that carry significant risk. This is especially true around cloud identities that directly expose your perimeter to the internet. On top of that, many or most of these identities, they don't have an owner, don't have policy, they don't even have expiries. So for that healthcare team that we worked with, this audit was the start of a very big change where leadership was finally able to see the scope of the problem and kickstart an initiative based on it. Now that we have inventory, we kind of grasp the problem. The question becomes, how do we secure all these accounts that we now know exist? And in order to secure them, we need to know that things are wrong in the first place. And of course, also have a good strategy for how to remediate. So if we take a look at this quote, something that's all too common is we hear about secrets being placed where they shouldn't be placed. And in this case, again, an unfortunately common example is a secret being shared insecurely over Slack. This is really risky, right? Research will show that most breaches these days are actually centered around credential misuse and not exploits. But it's even more than that, really, because when a credential is shared, unlike our human accounts, we typically don't have any of the other safeguards that we're used to. We don't have MFA, we don't have effective access policies, we barely even have anomaly detection. You'll notice something, by the way, at the end of this quote that's I think is very interesting and important, where they're saying that they deleted the message, but the credentials stayed live for months. And this is a really nuanced and important understanding. Just the fact that we deleted a message and removed the exposure doesn't mean we fully mitigated risk. If that secret was public, even for just a short amount of time, it might have gotten into the wrong hands. In a way, this is like trying to delete an embarrassing tweet that you uploaded and ignoring the fact that someone might have already screenshot it and shared it onwards. However, unlike tweets or images online, we do have a way to actually remediate in this case, and that is deactivating or revoking the secret or rotating it. And so the full solution here, if I was to recap, is having a system that firstly discovers risk around credential exposure and a variety of insecure sources or around anomalous behavior from them, but also importantly is having a very clear path to remediation by revoking or rotating potentially exposed credentials, all this without being a burden on developers, because as we all know, if something becomes a burden, then it'll just get sidestepped. I wanted to add this as just another example from our report we built for a client around some of their credential sprawl and exposure in areas, as you can see, such as GitHub public and private repos, public websites, and let's call it semi-public data dumps. By being able to identify their exposure, they were able to not only mitigate risk by removing those public exposures, but also to truly close the gap by revoking and rotating the exposed credentials before they get misused or abused. Another quote we hear pretty frequently is around ownership. And this one is tricky, right? Because even if you have a good inventory, it's not always easy to understand what an identity is doing or who is using it, or, is it even being used at all? And so the result is anytime you try to take action, you end up going on this wild goose chase, trying to understand who is the right person to be accountable for that action. A fellow practitioner actually told me this just a few days ago, and I really loved the quote. He said it's like a Legend of Zelda quest to find owners who can help inventory the use of especially legacy NHIs. Those that, have been there for a while, maybe the owner's changed 4 times already. And that often means finding an owner can take several days of interviews, going from person to person, up and down the chain, until hopefully you might find someone who's willing to say, yes, I'm accountable for this. Unfortunately, sometimes you'll just end up with no accountability at all. And without properly identifying an accountable individual, everything kind of grinds to a halt. No one wants to take action for fear of breaking something, right? There's no clear audit for actions. And of course, nothing can be automated because there isn't the process to facilitate that. The desired outcome here is a clear and living mapping of every account back to some individual, either directly or indirectly through an app or a group, whichever structure is most relevant. This will help holding people accountable to enforce proper lifecycle. Things like removing accounts when they're no longer needed, things like keeping privilege in check, and ensuring that everything remains compliant, which becomes more and more important every day. So if we take a step back from all these quotes and insights we've heard and try to understand what the foundations of securing NHIs really are, we understand that this is more than just something that you can get by with just extending your IAM tooling. Because again, the mental model, as we kind of talked about, it's completely different here. And so the tools you need to apply to the problem need to be different as well. And so when you're thinking of a platform, you should think of something that gives you three core capabilities. The first is visibility, right? You need to know what exists, what it's doing, and you need to have enough context about it so you really can understand it beyond just being a name or a static row in a table. Second is security. You need to understand how to effectively reduce exposure, especially as it comes to things like credentials or access. And the third, this is governance. You need to make all this sustainable through clear ownership and accountability, but also through methods of automation that streamline the entire process and really allow you to solve it at scale. And here's what it looks like when we try to put it all together in a playbook that we've helped build and run. If we start all the way at the bottom, um, we'll see that again, it starts with building those discovery capabilities, right? And it always has to start there. It's the cornerstone of any initiative, is taking stock of what we even have. The next immediate step, that's going to be context. You want to understand how these accounts are being used. You want to know end to end where they're used, what privilege they had, etc. Of course, third, you want to understand ownership. Who's accountable for what? As we said, nothing can happen if you don't have an accountable individual. Now, at this point, we can start monitoring. We can start understanding, we have an idea of what account exists. We want to make sure that the behavior is as it should be. This is where we can start looking at things like deviations or evaluations of our posture, right? That's going to be the next step. Naturally, after that, again, we have inventory, we're building context, we've assigned ownership, we're evaluating, monitoring, and evaluating posture. The next natural step is to start creating policies around those identity lifecycle management principles and slowly aligning the system with what your policies are. And this is interesting because usually organizations have a very good understanding of where they want to be, right? Or what they want to happen, what should happen. But it's very, very difficult to understand how different reality is from our policies at that point. And so now we have our policies, we have discovery, we understand posture, we can start prioritizing, focusing on the most important policy violations first, the most important and urgent risks first. And this is crucial, right? We want to focus our time always on the things that are most critical. At that point, of course, it's time to remediate. It's time to take action, solve those problems, realign them with those policies, going down that prioritized list. This will finally unlock for us capabilities around governing, enforcing the policies continuously and at scale. And then the pinnacle is evolving to doing this with automation and with flexibility. The journey, as we can see, allows us to move from ad hoc response at the start all the way to full identity lifecycle, one that's covering discovery, classification, controls, and policy, and handles expirations or remediations. Critically, as we reach the top there, we get to the point where it can be driven by automation in a flexible manner, which is essential to make this whole thing scale. This is how modern teams are adapting their IAM for the area or the era of non-human identities, both now and into the future. So that was a lot, right? If you're wondering where to start, I recommend remembering these three things. First, again, start by understanding what you have. Find the right tools to give you not just discovery, but also context of your NHIs, wherever they may be, right? Don't look only in one area. NHIs are everywhere now. You need to make sure you're covering your bases. From there, identify those low-hanging fruits. Something we always start with our customers is accounts that you no longer need. So for example, evaluate, confirm that they're not being used anymore, and reduce your attack surface by deactivating or deleting them. At this point, you're ready to start governing. Establish accountability by mapping NHIs back to your business so you can properly start defining your policies and enforcing them. So thanks for spending time with me today. I hope this gives you a clearer view into the challenges and the opportunities in securing non-human identities. And I truly think we're at a pivotal moment in the identity world where the human-focused tools we're familiar with are no longer enough. And a new problem, but also a new solution, is now emerging. So it's time to evolve our mindset, evolve our methods to protect every identity, even those that don't have a face, right? So let's keep the conversation going. And if you'd like to dive deeper, please feel free to reach out. Thanks again, and have a great identity management day.